So, about a year ago, this YouTuber who goes by Orangelo or Orangelo or something to that extent, hereforth referred to in this video as Nick, his given name, because I don't want to constantly be mispronouncing his YouTube moniker. He made a video called Anarcho-Capitalism and Anarcho-Communism, in which he responds to some questions that were left in his comments section by a particular YouTuber. And the questions which were left in, which he's responding to in his Anarcho-Capitalism and Anarcho-Communism video, were two-pronged. First prong, A, are you an anarchist? Second, what are your opinions of the current liberty movement? In this video, my first YouTube video, I will be responding to his critique of anarcho-capitalism, particularly the anarcho-capitalist justice system. Now you may be wondering, why am I going after that guy? Why am I going after this guy in particular? Don't you agree with about 95% of what he has to say? And I would say yes. And he's acknowledged this as well. See, Nick counts himself among the rising tide of internet opinion, calls themselves the alt-right, which is essentially a very strong nationalistic form of rightism, and they have strong pro-European influence, and they use this to interpret the founding, and they're essentially minarchists. Now, Nick's critique of anarcho-capitalism, which he says he's generally favorable toward anarcho-capitalists, it mostly has to do with the AnCap justice system. Now, I consider myself an anarcho-capitalist, although I prefer the term voluntarist, but I still call myself a libertarian in the American sense. I'd still consider myself an anarchist as well, just because of my particular interpretation of anarchism. I know there are a lot of people out there who wouldn't agree with me doing that. But to avoid conflict with them and to better clarify my own standpoint, where I'm coming from, I like to call myself a voluntarist. So early on in his video, Nick starts out with talking about what his foundations are for how he approaches questions of political philosophy. And they're rooted in essentially the same philosophical principle toward ethics that voluntarists have. He says that there are no particular actions which can be called moral or immoral without reference to property rights. Who owns what? Who has the rights to say what? Who has the rights to do what? And in what contexts. And so this is just a very, very general foundation upon which most libertarians can agree. And I'm sure Nick counts himself as a libertarian, more or less. He says there's really no difference between libertarianism and conservatism. And to some extent, I would agree. I'll concede him that. So, what are his objections to the voluntarist justice scheme? Very early on, Nick gives his response to this first question, which I alluded to earlier. Are you an anarchist? He responds with an emphatic, no, I am not an anarchist. And he's following critique. It's actually very brief. It's about 5 minutes long out of a 40-minute video, which he lays out his disagreements with anarcho-capitalism. And As I said earlier, they all they all hinge on the anarchist justice system. So, his ultimate conclusion is that a voluntarist society would produce results which are not only undesirable, but completely impossible as well. He says that in the long run, uh, a anarchist system cannot maintain itself because it will end up tending toward the establishment of a state. And in this video, as a response to his two claims that anarchism is impractical and undesirable from a lawmaking standpoint, I will be referencing some of the ideas which can be found in Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And I would encourage anybody who's interested in delving into this debate further to reading that book for themselves. It's a very dense book. It took me quite a long time to finish it just because I had to so often read and reread certain passages to really appreciate their meaning and really reflect upon what I had just read in that book. It's very difficult and dense, but if you really want to understand the debate between statism and voluntarism, you do well to check out that book. So, the first point which he brings up is the problem of glorified insurance companies which insure people against all sorts of crime and transgressions, as well as they may or may not provide national security. They may or may not have a penitentiary system which they control, may or may not have courts, although probably they would, and they may or may not undertake law enforcement themselves, or they could hire contractors and subcontractors to enforce the law themselves. So basically, the people who are responsible for justice and law in society, the DROs. He references the problem of two people having different DRO coverage, under which there are different sets of rules for conduct. Whose rules, whose terms do we proceed under in a voluntarist society? If we have a dispute between two people who have different DRO coverage. In Anarchy, State, and Utopia, Robert Nozick imagines a few different outcomes. Let's take the case of DRO A and DRO B. DRO A has a client which is stolen from DRO B. Now, it is the job of DRO A to defend their client in a court of law, presumably, and the job of DRO B to exact some form of compensation. The problem arises: who settles the matter? Now, it has been often proposed that both DROs would have come to a predetermined agreement over this, and would most likely settle over a third-party arbitrator to decide the matter. Now, this isn't there is no guarantee that they will come to an agreement anyway. So, that may lead to conflict. And by conflict, I do mean armed conflict, if these sorts of conflicts end up arising and cannot be settled frequently enough. And they may be settled, but as Nozick points out, if there is a power disparity between these two DROs, just in terms of arms or influence, that one DRO would end up consistently dominating over the other and imposing its rules onto the other DRO. And at that point, there is no point in the smaller, weaker DRO maintaining rules which are different from the more dominant DRO. So it is just a smaller, weaker purveyor of the same set of rules of justice. And at that point, since it is smaller and weaker, and is providing the same product, it's been speculated that the larger of the two firms, the more dominant firm, will buy out the smaller firm and create a monopoly in one geographical area. Or rather, this process will continue among all sorts of DROs until there is one dominant DRO in a geographical area. And so it is because of this tendency toward centralization and monopolization which would exist in a voluntary scheme of justice and law that Nozick and Nick both come to the same conclusion, that a voluntary society is unstable. A voluntary government, which is what Nozick ended up with, and what Nick described, is not a state just because it has a monopoly, a legal monopoly on this. It is the founding, the process of the founding, which really delineates a statist model from a voluntary model. And we can see from history that the United States did not follow the voluntary model. It was essentially just a group of old men, and they arbitrarily declared by their own whims that this massive territory that they called the United States was now under the jurisdiction of the body of law which they created on their own without anybody else's consent. We may have some fundamental disagreements of what constitutes a state and what does not. I believe that what constitutes a state versus what does not can only be determined if we look at the processes which gave rise to it. So I hope that that part of my video addressed Nick's claim that a voluntary society is necessarily self-defeating in the long run and that it will end up with the establishment of a state. Now on to his more practicality-based arguments against a voluntary society. He claims that a voluntary society's justice system might be inherently unfair toward the poor and those who just can't afford to buy better justice. He seems to come from the opinion that justice is not a commodity to be bought and sold, and that it's special among other commodities in that the market really can't handle self-reformation just through profit and loss, and that a profit-seeking DRO who runs a penitentiary system will have an incentive, a monetary incentive, toward just snatching people up and locking them away for dumb crimes. Now, first of all, I completely disagree with his opinion that justice is different from any other commodity. I think it is subject to the same market forces that the market for cars or the market for concerts or the market for education or anything of that nature. The market is still controlled by the same forces. People seek out goods and services which fulfill needs which they can't satisfy on their own. And if there was a problem of a penitentiary system or a justice system just scooping people up and locking them away for dumb crimes just so that they can profit from that, well, I think that their efforts, the penitentiary system's efforts, would be in vain. Because people, I'm assuming, in order to create any workable justice system, must value justice and fairness. And so, it's highly dependent on whatever people's preferences and people's values are, whether a system will work or not. This doesn't change just because you have a dictator in power. I think that today, in the age of information and technology and the internet, that there are resources, ever greater resources than there ever were in the past, for people to make generally well-informed decisions so that they can better achieve their goals in the marketplace. There are rating systems on Amazon. There's Consumer Reports online. Do you ever see this? Have you ever seen the UL label on your electronics? That's the Underwriters Laboratory label. And they are responsible for quality control in the electronics industry. And many retailers or wholesalers would not even buy or stock their shelves with products that don't have the UL label on them. Now, that is the power of the marketplace, to provide consumers with information of a product's quality. And if such information is lacking, well, then there will be a monetary incentive toward encouraging somebody to enter that field and take on the responsibility of quality control. And so I think if there is adequate freedom of the press in a voluntary society, and there are enough people who care about the integrity of their justice system, then these problems will work themselves out in the marketplace. And to the extent that they don't, there is no guarantee that a statist model would provide the services any more efficiently, satisfy any more desires than the voluntary model would. And who knows exactly what the United States would look like today. The geographical area called the United States would look like if we could go back in time and done things differently and enacted a voluntary society. They may look similar. There's nothing about the precepts of voluntarism which necessarily exclude many of the activities of the federal government today. Like, theoretically, people could consent to pretty much any of the current government's activities here in the United States. But the fact remains that they didn't. And the United States may look like a very different place today if it had followed a voluntarist model. Consider this. So, Nick claims that because a voluntary society would end up under a state eventually in the long run, which I hope that I made the case against in the preceding part of this video, that we should just more or less accept the current state which rules over us here in the United States. And that neither system is really better, whether the United States had been founded voluntarily or just things had gone the way they had gone anyway. Like, neither outcome is necessarily more desirable than the other. To this, I disagree. I ask how the Founding Fathers determined exactly what the size and shape of the United States government was. Well, I guess it just covered the geographical area that the states, the colonies, had occupied. But that in itself is pretty arbitrarily determined. The size of the monopolist, the government, the monopolist of law, called the government, really ends up affecting the quality of the service, which is called law, which it provides. And Nick sort of alluded to this in his video, actually. He stated his preference for locally made law over federally made law. Because at least if somebody doesn't like the locally made law, and there's mostly local law influence, then they can just quite easily pack their bags and move somewhere else. There isn't a lot of transaction cost in just moving a few towns over, as opposed to having to move outside the country completely to escape a tyrannical regime. So I think that force tends to keep government small. But on the other end of the spectrum, there's a force which tends to grow governments, which I had alluded to earlier in this video. So it is more efficient for one agent to provide law and justice within a geographical area than it is for multiple agents with conflicting rules to do so. That tends to grow the size of governments. After all, if you are doing business regularly with somebody outside of your DRO's coverage area, and you're striking major deals with these sorts of people constantly, and your DRO handles contracts differently than their DRO, or if you happen to come into dispute over something in the course of your business dealings, then, the cost of doing business might rise to the point where you might not choose to do business with people who don't have the same coverage of DRO as you have, which really puts a damper on commerce at the margins. So we can look at these two countervailing factors: growing the size of government, shrinking the size of government, and of course there are a whole bunch of factors dictating the shape of the shape of government. The shape of a government's territorial claims. That it's very unlikely that, had things been done voluntarily in the founding of the United States, that we would end up with a state which looks much different from what we have now. And since people weren't allowed to really exercise their preferences or consent, we can't really we have no way of knowing what we have now is the most efficient size and shape of government geographically. So I hope that gives a reason why someone should not accept the legitimacy of the United States as it currently is on practicality or morality grounds. Because A, a voluntary society does not inevitably lead to the establishment of a state. And B, having market forces influence the size geographically and the shape geographically of government is more efficient than the arbitrarily imposed representative democracy which we have forced on us today. I also hope to have proven the point that there are no problems which are inherent to the voluntary society, unlike the problems which are inherent in the statist model of justice, which are lack of accountability and no way of knowing how much and the quality and the nature of the good to be provided, which is called justice, which is a problem of all sorts of socialism, all sorts of non-market-based solutions to demands that people have, is there's just no way of knowing how much and what kind of good or service to supply to meet a demand. Even if the market isn't perfect, and we can assume that it's not, in satisfying that demand, it tends to be the best provider of those goods. And maybe I'll make a video later responding to externalities, because I really see that as like the strongest economic argument for the provision of some goods and services within a society. But that will be a video for a different time. And besides that, I have a third response to Nick's critique of the voluntarist justice system, is that Nick seems to assume, he seems to take for granted the fact that institutions which deal with justice in a voluntarist system, a voluntarist society, will resemble quite strongly the institutions we have under our statist model. There is no guarantee for this. Just as there's no guarantee that a voluntarist society would end up with some variation of the representative democracy that we have today, there is no guarantee that a voluntary society would have institutions which resemble the ones that we do. For example, in his book Practical Anarchy, Stefan Molyneux proposed an alternative model of justice which does not involve any guns. It does not involve any penitentiaries at all. All it involves is a court system. Justice is provided and made by the DROs, the insurance companies which I have alluded to throughout this entire video. Anyone with DRO coverage has some way of identifying themselves as being covered, whether they have a card or maybe in the future biometric scanners or something else linked to a database where anyone can vet whether somebody has DRO coverage or not. What does it mean to have for somebody to have DRO coverage if you are doing business with that person? It means somebody with DRO coverage has, at the very least, not violated the terms of their DRO coverage to the point that they have lost the coverage simply because they're too much of a liability. They're a liability to constantly be representing in court, constantly being sued by another DRO or by another person within that DRO. They're just too much of a financial liability to keep around, so they are dropped from coverage. Of course, that's not necessarily what not having DRO coverage means. One can easily imagine a situation in which there are some people who fall through the cracks. Through no fault of their own, they lack DRO coverage because they were born too poor or have fallen on hard times such that they are too poor to afford coverage. In that case, they live among the outcasts, who people refuse to do business with. Think about it. If you're a hotel, would you allow people to stay in your hotel if they lack DRO coverage? In that case, there's no way of knowing whether the person who wants to stay at your hotel is simply poor, has otherwise not decided to buy DRO coverage, or whether they are actually some violent criminal. So you may choose, as the owner of a hotel, to enforce a insured-only policy, in which you'd only allow people who were covered by DRO insurance to stay at your hotel, or buy a gun from you if you are a gun dealer, or rent out an apartment if you are a landlord. So, the idea is that if we just ostracize people from our goods and our services through voluntary means, then, we can sort the riffraff out from society. Now, I think this idea is very attractive because it does not involve any of the messy bits like guns and police and potential brutality. And on the other hand, it's also desirable because we wouldn't have to deal with the costs of prisons and locking people up. And besides that, many anarchists might be of the opinion that locking people up in a cage is a one-size-fits-all solution, and it's sort of arbitrary. Like, why would stealing from somebody warrant locking that person up in a cage, and doing cocaine would have the same outcome, and drunk driving would have the same outcome? It's just a one-size-fits-all punishment. Although I believe that, if we view prison as just a deterrent factor beyond compensation, strict compensation of the victim, to discourage similar acts being done in the future, then, it's not so bad. But another advantage of this model over a penitentiary model is that you eliminate the corruption between and among those wings of the justice system, which Nick cites as a potential problem of voluntary society. Now, of course, this is not a perfect solution. And as I mentioned before, there are pros, which I just mentioned, and there are cons as well. One of the cons is it's quite unenforceable. You might end up having somebody roam around in places that they shouldn't be. If there are dangerous people roaming around society, that's undesirable because you want them isolated from you, obviously. And there's no way to really keep them from hanging around you other than, refusing to do business with them. But if they're really determined and they're a career criminal and they really just want to rob a rich person, then I guess they could still do that. There's nothing keeping them physically restrained from polite society, as they might need to be. And even if your DRO builds these walls and sets up a surveillance state to sort of make the exclusion rules more enforceable, then Would that really be all that desirable either? Do we want a massive surveillance state combing through everyone's data and personal information and watching them and all of the workings of their lives? Do we really want massive walls and border checks into and out of every town that stop trucks and search them for stowaways and everybody else who's been expelled from society? Would that raise the cost of doing business? I don't think so. But again, that's my preference. That's not necessarily everyone else's preference. And in a nation of hundreds of millions of people, my opinion counts for very little. It is only in a framework of voluntary decision making by each individual that these questions of which model of justice we should adopt, what the size and scope of government should be, geographically and just policy-wise, that these questions can be answered justly. I know that some people say, oh, well, we'll just use our best judgment and carry on from there, and we know what's right and wrong, but there are some questions that need to be settled, and they don't have very clear answers. And so I guess that's just the heart of what I'm trying to say, is that, the answers are best left pursued to by individuals, and whether they make good decisions or bad decisions, that's, at least we can say that's up to them. They made the choice. I guess that's the heart of why I'm a libertarian, and that's essentially the heart of my argument. And I hope that Nick bears through this entire video to get to the end, and hopefully he has some thoughts. Hopefully he's intrigued. Hopefully I haven't missed the point of his video entirely, and hopefully I haven't just wasted everybody's time. But again, this is my first video. And I apologize, but I'm just really interested in what this guy has to say. I think he's a very interesting individual, and he has some good ideas. But I do have some fundamental disagreements with him about the proper role of government, and I'd like to see how he responds to me, if he chooses to respond to me. And I hope he does.